All right, so this is the beginning of section 4, which is called Fighting the War. And in this section, I'm going to talk about, there are 4 subsections in the sections. They are, in the section, they are fighting a guerrilla war with mobility. The second one is old weapons. The third one is new weapons. And the fourth one is atrocities. Okay, and I'll announce them each time I come to them. I may have to divide this section into 2. I suspect it'll run fairly long. In fighting a guerrilla war with mobility, one of the things that the Americans hit when they arrived in Vietnam was that they were fighting a guerrilla war. And this is something which they had to come to terms with. They were not used to fighting unconventional wars. They hadn't successfully fought an unconventional war or tried to. World War II was considered to be conventional in the sense that the American army went with its allies up against other armies that fought in ways that were similarly tactical. You fought with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, and you maneuvered. In other words, people were trained in the same kinds of European military tactics that people had learned from World War I, and most of the generals in World War II had been officers like captains or colonels in World War I. So these are the people who ran the war, and as a result, they were determined World War II would not look like World War I, and it didn't. But when they got to fighting in Korea, which they did, or the Americans supported the South Koreans fighting the Korean War in the 50s, they were dealing with a different kind of enemy because they were fighting the North Koreans and the Chinese. And then when they arrived in Vietnam, they brought with them tactics that were basically still World War II tactics, which had also been to some extent used in Korea. These tactics would no longer work. And American military policy faced the North Vietnamese and struggled with how to deal with them. No matter what the Americans tried, they killed an incredible number of Vietnamese, but they also couldn't win the war. And for a long time, for almost the entire war, the enemy fought a guerrilla war, which worked very well for Mao in China against the nationalist Chinese, supported by, again, the Americans, supporting Chiang Kai-shek and his regime against the communist Chinese. And they lost. And for Giap and Ho in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, the leader, and Giap, sometimes Giap, who was the general basically in charge of fighting the Americans, and the French. The rules of guerrilla warfare were relatively simple. You don't fight if you can't win, run away when you have to, don't stand and fight and die just because. It's like, that's a stupid thing to do. If you're underpowered, don't go and stand up and get killed. So fighting that didn't mean that the North Vietnamese didn't ask their people to take losses. They did, and they sustained terrible losses. But it also meant that you take the long view, which is that you have an enormous amount of patience and you are prepared to wait it out. The Americans responded to guerrilla war by organizing the country into this grid, which we've looked at already: I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps. And they began to use computers like the ones that are behind me here on the screen, big mainframes that hadn't existed during World War II. And they began to basically run simulations of how to fight the war in Vietnam. So one of the things that makes this an early postmodern war is that there is the bringing of high processor data power, data crunching basically to the war. So what we're looking at here, just turning our image to the attention to these three images I've given us, is the IBM 360-370 mainframe computer, which now is the processing power of a machine like this is basically in your laptop, but it used to fill a room, literally. The drums you can see it. If I point to them, it's going to screw things up, but you'll see them in the top image on the left. Okay, to my left. It's up here. Here, I'll move near it. this image here above me, you'll see just above me are these two sort of hemispherical openings. These are actually disk drives, and the disks are big platters that can be written to, and they're big. They're spindles, and they have a series of disks on them. And then to the left is a printer. Still one of the fastest. Well, not actually. That isn't the fastest, but there still is. The line printer is still one of the fastest printers that there is. To my immediate left now is a card reader. This is a punch card reader, which is this is the descendant of the Hollerith punch card machines, which IBM developed. Well, Hollerith, which became IBM, developed to use to fight the war, and the Nazis used them to count basically who was going into the death camps, and so on. You'll see more disk drives to my immediate left. So just here is a disk drive, there are disk drives. And then up above is above me in the black and white picture. I'll move myself around now. So here is this is what the interface looked like. So you could interact in real time with the computer through this interface. This was a huge deal. This is really where the ARPANET started. And the ARPANET started as a series, not of small network computer, but of big mainframes like this, so-called Big Iron. Okay. And so one of the things that the Americans did with Big Iron was they simulated how to fight the Vietnam War, and they used numbers to calculate where would the Vietnamese, to predict their behavior and to understand where the Vietnamese were going to appear. This is going to appear in Go Tell the Spartans. So remember these images when we get to Go Tell the Spartans. While playing war games, or just wargaming as it's now called, is really an old thing. Chess is, for instance, a war game and was usually used to train people in how to fight. In German, it's called a Kriegspiel, which is literally a war game. A Spiel is a game, and Krieg is war. So the Kriegspiel was a war game where it had various, sometimes you reenacted battles with people, basically, and you played out different, basically you simulated different, like how might the battle have gone, especially with particular failures, with losses. They were like, well, what if Napoleon had done this at Waterloo, would that have worked, and so on. The United States had, during World War II, developed think tanks, the most famous of which is the RAND Corporation, the R&D, that is Research and Development Corporation, which just became the RAND, R-A-N-D. You can look up the RAND now, and you can download a whole bunch of their books, actually, for free. The RAND is happy to give away their information. They make a lot of money selling their studies to usually the military, but also to industry. I'm talking about the American military, but they aren't the only game in town. There are, well, now hundreds of think tanks which take up political, military, economic issues, and they begin to game them, and they game them with increasing sophistication. That doesn't mean they're right, but they're sophisticated. So the RAND Corporation was called on to wargame Vietnam, and they did. So the policies that come out of the RAND Corporation pretty much go, this is one of these things where there's really a fluid exchange between industry, which is studying how to fight the war, and industry, which is making materials to fight the war, like Boeing, Raytheon, Grumman, United Technologies, Dow, Monsanto, big chemical companies, basically, and big industrial companies that are making weapons, Lockheed Martin, and so on. So the technologists basically are working in the RAND Corporation and other think tanks are producing policy which is being purchased by the technology companies. And the technology companies have a huge stake in the US Senate, the federal Senate, and the Congress, the House. Right? So that means that it's very, very hard to see sometimes whether you're dealing with somebody from GM who is making government policy. Are they making government policy? Because there's, by the time we get into the 60s, it's a tradition that people, it's understood that people will go back and forth between high industry and government positions, which are not elected positions, right? So people who say work for Raytheon don't go run for election. Some might, but mostly they go in as advisors. So are they advising what's good for the United States, or are they advising what's good for Raytheon? And the argument always is, what's the difference, right? Okay. So